Hello, welcome back. When we last left off on the Paleolithic to Neolithic lecture, we were talking about how there were hints of Neolithic culture that we could see in some of the Paleolithic art that we were looking at. And so we're right back on that slide. And that leads to talking about the Neolithic culture. So what is the difference between the Neolithic time period versus the Paleolithic time period? When we say culture, remember there is no such thing as one Neolithic culture, just like there's no such thing as one Paleolithic culture. These would be cultures. But the main transformation that happens into the Neolithic period is the development of farming and the living in small villages and towns, and the towns start to become walled, like larger type cities, where we start to see the beginnings of the idea of people um, having specific roles in that town, not just everyone doing the same thing. This begins roughly, we're not exactly sure, but roughly about somewhere between 11,000 and 8,000 BCE. And we see a number of different sites where we see the beginnings of the Neolithic period. But around the globe, the beginnings of the Neolithic period actually might happen much later, maybe as late as 5,000 or 4,000 or even 3,000 BCE. Also in the Neolithic period, we see the beginnings of some sort of organized religion. Obviously, from the art that we looked at in the Paleolithic, there was already some sort of religious or some sort of spiritual kind of experience. But with these, a little bit more something like what we would call organized religion. Okay, the primary site that I'm going to talk about today is Catal Huyuk, which is one of the earlier sites that were discovered. It's a Paleolithic or Neolithic site in Turkey. And let me go back to the previous slide just for a second. Right over here, you can see the floor plan of the town, and it was a walled town. And interestingly enough, it had its own very unique kind of sense of defense, which was all the buildings in the town were butted right up against each other. There was no such thing as a street, right? So and there were no such things as front doors. No one could get into anyone else's houses except through doors in the ceiling, which, when you think about it, makes it a very easy to defend kind of town, because it means that any invader would have to invade each space separately, and every space that they had to invade, they'd have to jump down into a dark space, and they'd have no idea how many people might be waiting down there to get them. So it had some kind of unusual defense ideas built in there. So here are some images, some photographs from and some reconstructions from Catal Huyuk. And one of the things I wanted to cover, or to just go over one more time, was the idea that in the Neolithic culture we see echoes of some of the things that we saw in the Paleolithic. So we see frescoes, kind of wall paintings that are similar to cave paintings in that, or similar to what we saw in cave paintings. These are hunting scenes, and that you also have things like bulls, and in a lot of these spaces we had these little shrines, like here, where bull skulls were plastered into the wall, or like this kind of shrine, and hunters painted on walls with leopard skins, and also an obsession with lions and leopards, large cats, as kind of totem animals, like this wall carving with two leopards kind of facing each other. So, and also in the Neolithic art, we have a continuation of kind of the Earth Mother motif, just like we talked about with the Venus figurines in the Paleolithic. Um, and one thing that's different, new, in Jericho, a different Neolithic town, we see the example of kind of a cult of the dead, where it appears that people were taking the skulls of deceased ancestors and then plastering them over to kind of recreate, and then keeping those as kind of like emblems of, or symbols of the deceased relative. And one other thing I did want to talk about the fact that another thing that we see in the Neolithic period is we do see the beginnings of pottery, and very early on, pottery starts to develop quite sophisticated styles of decoration, and these styles of decoration actually quickly become quite international. We see something similar to this, not quite this early, but something similar to this. About 1,000 years later, all over parts of Asia. Last thing I want to cover is that information about both the Paleolithic and the Neolithic is constantly changing, and here is some late breaking news that I've just added to this lecture. When I did this lecture last year, I just kind of mentioned Göbekli Tepe as being possibly the oldest site, and then since then, a number of documentaries have come out about Göbekli Tepe, and it's becoming quite clear that it's not just the oldest Neolithic site, but it's also an extraordinarily unusual site where we have a real example of a religious cult, and where this site seems to have no forms of Neolithic towns. There's none of these are living spaces. These are all kind of religious shrine kind of sites, and they're all decorated. All of these giant posts have carvings on them. Either they have animal carvings, like totem animal carvings on them, or they have carvings of figures, so that like the posts actually have arms drawn down the side, as if these are giants holding up the ceiling of each of these spaces. Okay, that ends the lecture on Paleolithic to Neolithic. And in class on Monday, we will start to talk about some of the implications of that to contemporary art. All right, thank you.